Well, here we are at our final passage of the book of Ecclesiastes. And what we'll see today is that this last passage in Ecclesiastes proves a very fitting ending to what we've seen in the book as a whole. In it, we see the teacher's final search for meaning under the sun. We see the final warning to listen to the teacher's words. And we hear the book's final conclusion about where true and lasting meaning can be found. And in our talk today, we'll look at these one at a time. In the bulk of our passage today, in chapter 11, verse 7 to chapter 12, verse 7, we see the teacher's final search for true and lasting meaning under the sun. In verses 7 and 8, the teacher reflects on the goodness of life under the sun. He says that life, like the kind of sunny spring days that we've had recently, can be sweet and pleasing. However many years you live, says the teacher, enjoy them all. But as soon as the teacher says this, he's forced by the realities of life under the sun to add a caveat, a significant caveat. Yes, there are days of light and life, but there will also be days of darkness as well. In fact, the teacher says that there will be many dark days for each of us, and that many of these days are still to come. So like chapters 9 and 10, the uncertainties of the future, the reality of death, and the prospect of hard and dark days ahead lead the teacher to say that everything to come is meaningless. Given everything to come is meaningless, the teacher stops and asks, well, what about now? Can true and lasting meaning be found now in the days of our youth? And like many of the teacher's previous searches, it seems like there's real promise here. He says in verse 9 that the days of youth are often happy days, often days filled with joy and freedom. And it's true, isn't it, that people often look back fondly on the days of their youth. People often try and relive the days of their youth well into old age. So is it youth that can provide us with true and lasting meaning under the sun? Well, no. The teacher says it can't because youth is so quickly overshadowed by old age and death. And to prove it, the teacher gives us a poem with 4 different groups of images that drive home this reality. The first image in chapter 12, verse 2 is of an incoming storm. The clouds, like old age, slowly but surely block out the light from the sun, the moon, and the stars until there's only darkness left. The second picture in verses 3 and 4 is of a house decaying. The workers of the house tremble and grow few in number. The owners of the house begin to stoop and grow dim. The doors of this house are eventually closed, and the sounds of life and productivity within begin to fade. The third picture that we get in verse 5 is of nature waning. We're told that the almond tree begins to blossom at the start of spring, and so we would expect new life to be coming. But the grasshopper drags itself along, no longer able to jump. And the desire of the old person is no longer stirred within them. I'll leave you to think about what that one means. The teacher at the end of verse 5 says that soon after old age comes, people go to their eternal home. They die, and mourners fill the streets. The fourth and final picture in verses 6 and 7 is of tools that shatter and break. The teacher says that the silver cord will be severed and the golden bowl broken. The pitcher which draws water will be shattered at the spring, and the wheel at the well will break. We'll all wear out, the teacher says. Our bodies will return to the ground that they came from, and our spirit to the God who gave it. So, can youth or young age provide us with true and lasting meaning under the sun? Well, no, it can't. And that's because it's always confronted by the realities of old age and death. What does all of this mean for us? Well, we should, I think, enjoy the freedom and happiness of our youth while we still have it. It's a good thing, and there's nothing wrong with that, the teacher says. But we should be very careful, as the teacher reminds us twice in our passage, to remember God in the days of our youth. That is, while we're young, we should remember where true and lasting meaning is to be found. The teacher's saying, don't wait for your midlife crisis. Remember God now, love him now, serve him now, even when things are good. And I think it's important for us to recognize too the difference that as Christians, that knowing Jesus makes to this process of growing old and dying. All of what the teacher observes here about old age and death is true. But in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul can say that while his outer self is wasting away, suffering and wearing thin, his inner self is renewed day by day. Because Paul knows the reality of the resurrection and the glory that awaits him in Christ, he can face old age and death with faith and hope. And through faith in Christ, we can share in that same hope as we eventually grow old and die. The second and much quicker thing that we see in our passage today is a final warning to listen to the words of the teacher. I wonder if you've asked while reading the book of Ecclesiastes, what are we meant to do with all of this? It can easily, I think, seem very abstract and very existential. So what are we actually meant to do about it practically? Well, the teacher begins by reminding us of the conclusion that we're meant to be responding to back from chapter 1. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And by the time we've got here in chapter 12, verse 8, we've seen that truth for ourselves. Everything under the sun, the things that we can touch and taste and observe, are meaningless. And that's because they're frustrated by the uncertainties of life and the certainty of death. And in verse 9 and 10, we're reminded that we can trust these words from the teacher as words that are upright and true. And in verse 11, we're told at least 2 ways that we can begin to put them into practice. One of the ways that we can begin to put these words into practice is to use them as a goad. If you've got no idea what a goad is, you're in good company. I had to Google it. It turns out that a goad is like a cattle prod. It's meant to poke us and correct us when we stray from the right path. I wonder if there's been moments in Ecclesiastes where you've thought that maybe, just maybe, you might be looking for meaning in the wrong places. Perhaps it's been in achievement or in pleasure. Perhaps it's in relationships or in high expectations of what the future holds. Whatever it might be, let the book of Ecclesiastes correct you, prod you and poke you like a goad, and put you right on the back on the right path. Another way that we can apply the book of Ecclesiastes is to use the teacher's words like firmly embedded nails to hold us where we are. Our Christian walk is a lifelong race. And if you don't feel the temptations and pull of these false paths to meaning now, I can almost guarantee that you will at some stage. So let the book of Ecclesiastes firmly nail you down. Let it deepen your convictions about where true and lasting meaning is found, and don't be moved. We can apply the book of Ecclesiastes to our lives. And the teacher reminds us that these words ultimately come from one shepherd. I take that to be a reference to God. And so we can apply these words, and as God's words, we must apply them. Thirdly and finally for our talk, we see the conclusion of the book as a whole. Everything under the sun has been said and done, tested, and found wanting. And so we're told we must fear God and keep his commandments. Now, this doesn't mean we're to be afraid of God, nor is it kind of commending legalism. The teacher is saying that true and lasting meaning comes from recognizing and respecting God and living life his way. And the teacher gives us two really important reasons why this is so deeply meaningful. Firstly, he says it's the duty of all mankind. A more literal translation of that verse is that this is all that there is to mankind. This is what we are made for and what we're about. A Christian or non-Christian, it doesn't matter. We're made by God to know God and to live God's way. Augustine, in his famous quote, puts it this way: God has made us for himself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in him. Knowing God and living his way is what we are made for. And in Christ, it is what we are saved for. And this is where true and lasting meaning is to be found. And the sad truth is that the more we wander from this, the more empty and restless our lives will feel. The second reason why fearing God and keeping his commandments is so deeply meaningful is that we'll be judged. The teacher reminds us that everything we do, openly or hidden, good or evil, will be judged. As Christians, we know that our salvation is not about what we do, but what Jesus has done for us. And so we can have total confidence when it comes to our final judgment. But the Bible does tell us that there will still be a judgment for us of sorts. And we will all need to give an account of what we've done in the body. Can I suggest to you that rather than that being a worrying thing, a thing that causes fear, that this is actually a deeply meaningful thing? It means that everything we do actually matters. It means that everything we do can either be pleasing or displeasing to God. And in the security of our salvation, we don't need to despair, but we can actually embrace this and live by this. Think about it. Every day that we live will be judged. And it matters. It matters to God. Every decision we make will be judged, and it matters. Everything we do in Christ can be for God, and it can actually be pleasing to him. And so the reality of coming judgment should colour every aspect of our lives with deep and significant meaning. Fearing God and keeping his commandments is where true and lasting meaning is found. It's what we're made for, and it's what will matter in the end. So, brothers and sisters, remember God in the days of your youth. Hear and apply these words of the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes and live a meaningful life, fearing God and keeping his commandments.